Boots. Get out of that seat now. You've held up a very important man long enough. The words came from a gate agent who had never once looked doctor. Boots. Camille Ashworth in the eye before saying them. They landed in the middle of a hushed departure lounge in Scottsdale, Arizona, and every head turned, the way heads turned toward the sound of a plate breaking in a quiet restaurant. Boots. Camille didn't move, she didn't blink. She simply closed the paperback in her lap, one finger still marking her page, and looked up at the woman standing over her as if she were reading a line of very small print. Boots. To understand how a woman ended up ordered out of her own paid seat by an airline she owned, you have to go back 4 hours, to a kitchen in Tempe that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and old coffee grounds. Boots. The Sterling Point terminal outside Scottsdale was built to feel like a resort that happened to have runways, cream marble floors. Boots. A ceiling of reclaimed walnut beams, a 10-foot stone fireplace that burned gas flames even in July, because someone in corporate had decided that fire made people feel safe enough to spend money. Boots. The air smelled of eucalyptus diffuser oil and the particular bitterness of $6 espresso. Soft jazz piped through hidden speakers, the kind of music designed to be forgotten the second you stopped listening to it. Boots. Camille Ashworth sat in a corner armchair, dressed in gray joggers, a faded Arizona State hoodie with a small bleach stain on the cuff, and a pair of white sneakers that had clearly walked a few thousand miles. Boots. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. On the side table sat a paperback novel with a cracked spine and a paper coffee cup, the lid slightly dented from where she kept pressing her thumb into it out of habit. Boots. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be that morning, an unremarkable woman flying somewhere unremarkable. She was in fact the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Sky Holdings, the parent company that owned Sterling Point Executive Air, the very charter airline she was about to fly. Boots. Her name did not appear on the boarding pass. The ticket read C. Reyes, her late mother's maiden name, the same name she had used every single time she flew commercial under the radar to check on her own operation, the way a chef tastes a dish before it leaves the kitchen. Boots. 3 years earlier, Camille had built Meridian Sky out of a single leased Cessna and a promise she made at her mother's hospital bed. Boots. Delphine Reyes had spent 31 years as a housekeeper at a 5-star resort in Sedona, folding towels into swans for people who never learned her name, standing at the edges of ballrooms she was never allowed to enter as a guest. Boots. Camille remembered being 9 years old, waiting in the staff parking lot for her mother's shift to end, watching wealthy families stride past her mother like she was part of the architecture. Boots. Her mother used to say, "Baby, the way people treat you when they think you're nobody, that's who they really are." Boots. Camille had built an entire company on that sentence. There was a smaller memory too, one Camille rarely told anyone. Boots. She was 14, waiting with Delphine at a bus stop outside that same resort at 11 at night, both of them exhausted, when a valet in a crisp uniform had asked her mother, gently enough, but firmly, to move away from the entrance because a wedding party was arriving, and we need this area to look presentable. Boots. Her mother had simply stepped back into the shadow of a hedge without a word of protest, the way she'd learned to do 1,000 times before, and Camille had stood there, memorizing the exact angle of her mother's shoulders, the specific way dignity looks when it's being quietly folded up and put away so someone else doesn't have to feel uncomfortable. Boots. She promised herself, at 14, in the dark by that hedge, that she would build something someday where nobody's mother ever had to step into a shadow again. Boots. Now Meridian Sky ran 41 aircraft out of 6 hubs, and the number Camille checked every single morning before coffee wasn't revenue. Boots. It was complaint tickets tagged customer dignity, a category she had created herself, one nobody else in the private aviation industry bothered to track. Boots. She read every single one personally, even now, even with a company worth more than she could have imagined at that bus stop. Boots. It was the one number that told her whether the company was actually becoming what she'd promised, or just getting bigger while staying exactly the same underneath. Boots. That morning she had exactly 90 minutes of anonymity left before she had to become herself again, and she intended to enjoy every second of it. Boots. The couple arrived like weather. Rourke Delacroix walked into the lounge the way certain men walk into rooms they've never been asked to leave. Chest first, phone already at his ear, a leather duffel with his own monogram stitched into the side, even though the bag had clearly been purchased, not earned. Boots. His blazer was a shade of burgundy no tailor would have recommended, and his watch, a chunky gold thing, caught the fireplace light every time he gestured, which was constantly. Boots. He was mid-sentence when he crossed the threshold, and he stayed mid-sentence for the next several minutes. No, listen to me. Tell Marcus the Bishop Ridge deal closes Thursday, or it doesn't close at all. Boots. I don't care what his lawyers say. I built that entire district from nothing. Behind him trailed Celine Ferris, his fiancée, dressed in a cream tracksuit with rhinestone lettering across the back that spelled out a word Camille didn't bother reading. Boots. Celine's face had the particular tightness of someone who visits the same cosmetic surgeon twice a year and calls it maintenance. Boots. She surveyed the lounge with the flat disappointment of a woman inspecting a hotel room below her expectations. This is it? Boots, she said, not lowering her voice at all. This is the private terminal? I've seen nicer Panera locations, Rourke. Boots. Her eyes swept the room and snagged, briefly, on Camille. On the hoodie, the sneakers, the paperback, and something in Celine's expression curdled into contempt before sliding past, the way you'd glance at a stain on a carpet you weren't responsible for cleaning. Boots. Camille turned a page. In her mind quietly, she logged it the way she logged everything. Lounge atmosphere compromised by 2 guests engaging in performative volume. Boots. Staff visibly tensing. Watch how this develops. She had learned, over the years, that watching was its own kind of data collection, and that people revealed the truest version of themselves in the first 90 seconds of a room, before they remembered they were being watched at all. Boots. Rourke ended his call with a booming, "Just get it done," and clapped his hands together like he'd won something. Boots. All right, babe, let's grab seats. Big night ahead. Foundation Gala in Aspen, half the state legislature's gonna be there, and I need FaceTime with Warwick before the vote on the water rights bill. Boots. They chose the seating cluster directly across from Camille, close enough that their conversation became the room's only soundtrack. Boots. They complained. In order. The champagne selection. This is basically Costco Prosecco, the Wi-Fi speed, the temperature of the fireplace. Can someone turn that down? I'm sweating through Zegna. And finally, at volume, the general incompetence of what Rourke called the help. Boots. Camille kept reading. It was harder than usual. An hour later, a gate agent named Priya Kowalski walked into the center of the lounge, holding a tablet against her chest like a shield. Boots. She was 26 years old, 11 months into the job, and her voice cracked slightly on her first word. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have everyone's attention, please? Boots. We have a situation with Flight 642 to Aspen. A collective groan moved through the room, the particular groan of people who paid a great deal of money specifically to never hear the word situation. Boots. Due to an unscheduled maintenance issue, Priya continued, eyes locked on her tablet rather than any actual face, we've had to substitute a smaller aircraft. Boots. Unfortunately, this means the flight is oversold by 1 seat. We're offering a $6,000 travel credit and a confirmed seat on tomorrow's first departure to any passenger willing to volunteer. Boots. Silence. Nobody in that room was interested in trading tonight for a voucher. Their time was the one thing none of them would sell. Boots. Priya's gaze moved across the lounge, past a quiet older man reading the Wall Street Journal, past a woman in scrubs checking her phone with visible urgency, past a couple murmuring in Cantonese, and stopped with something like relief on Camille. Boots. The hoodie, the sneakers, no entourage, no watch, no noise. Priya made the fastest, most unconscious calculation of her professional life. This one won't fight back. Boots. She walked over, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the marble. Ma'am. Her voice had shifted into a register of false gentleness. Boots. I'm going to need you to gather your things. Camille lowered the book slowly, one finger still holding her page. Boots. Is there a problem? There's a seating conflict, Priya said, gesturing loosely toward Rourke, who had already stood and was smoothing the front of his blazer with the satisfaction of a man watching justice be served in his favor. Boots. Mr. Delacroix is one of our priority clients, and given the circumstances, we need to move you to tomorrow's flight. Boots. It was not phrased as a request. It never is the first time. Something in Camille went very still. Not frozen, not frightened, but still the way deep water is still, holding enormous pressure beneath a calm surface. Boots. The woman named C. Reyes quietly stepped aside. Dr. Camille Ashworth, founder and CEO of the company whose name was on every jet parked outside that window, took her place instead. Boots. I see, Camille said. Her voice hadn't risen a single decibel. And what is that decision based on? Priya blinked, thrown by the question. Boots. She had expected tears or begging or at worst a raised voice she could apologize her way past. She had not expected an audit. Boots. It's standard procedure. We prioritize our highest value clients. And Mr. Delacroix is your highest value client, Camille repeated slowly, like she was turning the sentence over to check it for cracks. Boots. By what metric? Total spend? Flight frequency? Or is it simply volume of complaint? A short laugh escaped someone across the room before they could stop it. Boots. The man with the Wall Street Journal lowered his paper an inch. Rourke didn't like being a punchline. He crossed the room in 6 long strides, planting himself close enough that his cologne, something aggressively woodsy, arrived a full second before his voice did. Boots. Look, sweetheart, I don't know what your deal is, but I've got a state senator waiting on me in Aspen and a 9-figure development deal riding on tonight. Boots. Your time is, his eyes flicked over her hoodie with open disdain, clearly not worth as much as mine. Boots. Probably flying on points, Celine said, loudly enough to be heard 3 rows back, not bothering to lower her voice or hide her smirk. Boots. Some people just don't know when to stay in economy. A man near the fireplace lowered his newspaper an inch, then raised it again, choosing, like most people in that lounge, the safety of not seeing. Boots. That was the first small cruelty of the afternoon. Not what Rourke and Celine said, but how easily a room full of comfortable people let it happen, because objecting out loud might cost them something too. Boots. Camille noticed. She always noticed. It went into the same silent ledger as everything else. I don't believe we've been introduced, Camille said, and there was something in the stillness of her voice that made Rourke's smirk falter for just a fraction of a second before he covered it with a louder laugh. Boots. We don't need to be. I'm telling you how this works. You're in my way. I'm in a chair I paid for, Camille said. Boots. That you would like removed. Those are different sentences, Mr. Delacroix, he snapped, as if the name alone should have ended the conversation days ago. Boots. Rourke Delacroix. Look me up sometime, sweetheart. Bishop Ridge. Canyon Vista. I don't do small, I have, Camille said simply, and let the silence after that land exactly where it wanted to. Boots. Camille did not look at either of them. Her attention stayed on Priya, steady as a held note. Priya. She read the name tag with deliberate precision. Boots. Let me ask this a different way. On whose specific authority are you removing a ticketed, checked-in, confirmed passenger from her seat, against her will? Boots. Priya's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. This was not going the way the manual described. It's company policy. Boots. My station manager can confirm it. Then get him, Camille said, and folded her hands in her lap, the picture of a woman with absolutely nowhere else to be. Boots. Rourke laughed, incredulous. You're seriously going to hold up my flight for this? Do you have any idea what an hour of my time costs? Boots. I imagine considerably less than you think, Camille said, given that you haven't asked me a single question about mine. Boots. Celine stepped forward now, sensing an opening, going for the wound she assumed would land hardest. Oh my God, look at her. Boots. That sweater probably came from a clearance rack. She's probably never even been on a real private jet before. Someone should just call security and have her walked out. Boots. Celine, Rourke said, not to stop her, but with the pleased tone of a man watching a dog do a trick he'd taught it. Boots. Tell her about the time you almost got kicked off a flight for arguing with the flight attendant over blanket temperature. Boots. That was different, Celine said, tossing her hair. I was a paying premium client. Her eyes raked over Camille one more time, slow and deliberate, the kind of look designed to leave a mark. She's clearly not anyone. Boots. The words landed harder than Celine probably intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. There is a particular kind of insult that isn't about volume at all. It's about being looked at and then, in the same breath, being decided not to matter. Boots. Camille had absorbed that look 1,000 times over the course of her life, first as a 9-year-old in a staff parking lot, later as a young founder pitching investors, who addressed all their questions to the white male engineer standing beside her. Boots. She had learned a long time ago that the correct response to that particular cruelty was never to shrink. It was to become perfectly, unbearably still and let the other person's own ugliness fill the silence she left behind. Boots. She said nothing, She let it sit there, ugly and exposed, in the middle of a room full of witnesses who were all, very carefully, pretending not to hear it. Boots. Before Priya could respond, a man in a slightly too tight navy suit burst into the lounge, a Bluetooth earpiece blinking blue at his temple, sweat already gathering at his hairline. Boots. Priya, what is the holdup? I've got Delacroix's assistant calling my direct line. This was Grady Voss, the station manager, 44 years old. 7 years into a job he had started to treat as a personal fiefdom. Boots. His eyes landed on Camille and performed the same lazy math Priya's had. Simple clothes, no entourage. Reading a paperback like she had nowhere better to be. Boots. An obstacle, not a person. Ma'am, Grady said, adopting the tone people use on children and dogs. Let's be reasonable. Boots. Mr. Delacroix is a very important client. He needs to be in Aspen tonight. You don't. Take the voucher and let's all move on with our evening. Boots. Camille raised one eyebrow, unhurried. You're the station manager? I am. He said it like a title should end the conversation. Boots. And it's your professional judgment, Camille said, that the correct response to your airline's own scheduling failure is to physically remove a paying customer based on a subjective and frankly discriminatory read of her importance next to his volume. Boots. Nobody said discriminatory. Grady snapped, color rising in his neck. This is business. Common sense. Common sense, Camille repeated, and something in her tone made 3 separate people in that lounge go quiet without knowing exactly why. Boots. She had spent 11 years building an aviation company on precision, on data, on the deliberate elimination of exactly this kind of common sense. Boots. To hear her life's work casually dismissed by a man in a wrinkled suit felt less like an insult to her, and more like an insult to everyone who had ever been waved off a flight, a job, a table, an opportunity, because someone decided in 4 seconds that they simply didn't look important enough to matter. Boots. Yes, common sense, Rourke boomed, emboldened now that management had arrived to back him. My deal versus her little book club trip. Boots. Are you getting up, or are we doing this the hard way? What does the hard way look like, exactly? Boots, Camille asked, tilting her head slightly, genuinely curious the way a scientist might ask a subject to clarify their hypothesis. Boots. Rourke blinked, caught off guard by the question landing so calmly instead of the fear he'd expected. He recovered by turning to Grady. Boots. Get security, get her bag. If she won't move, you move her. Boots. Grady hesitated. The first flicker of doubt he'd shown all afternoon. But Rourke's voice had the particular authority of a man used to being obeyed, simply because he was loud, and Grady had spent 7 years at Sterling Point, learning that loud men got what they wanted, one way or another. Boots. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you formally. If you don't voluntarily give up the seat, we will have to treat this as a refusal to comply with crew instruction, and that can mean removal by security and a flag on your travel record. Boots. The threat hung there, ugly and specific. It was no longer a request, or even a demand. It was a legal-sounding warning, dressed up to sound like policy, designed to frighten an ordinary passenger into folding. Boots. Camille recognized the tactic immediately. She had, in fact, once had to fire an employee at a different hub for using almost the exact same script. Boots. You're threatening to have me flagged, she said slowly, for the crime of sitting in the seat I paid for. Boots. I'm doing my job, Grady snapped, sweat now visible at his collar. No, Camille said. You're doing the version of your job that's easiest, on the passenger you assumed was safest to bully. Boots. Those aren't the same thing, Mr. Voss, even if no one has ever told you the difference. Camille looked from Rourke's smug, sweating face to Grady's weak, nervous one. Boots. She had asked her questions. She had stated her position with total clarity. She had given them every opportunity to simply do their jobs correctly. Boots. They had chosen instead to escalate. She rose to her feet, unhurried, unbothered, the movement of a woman with nothing to prove, and reached into her worn leather tote. Boots. Grady's face went through a small spasm of relief, assuming she was about to pull out a phone to film them for some social media complaint he could later dismiss as context missing. Boots. There's really no need to record this, he started. Let's not make a scene. I have no intention of making a scene, Camille said, and something in her voice had shifted, not louder but sharper, like a blade finding its edge. Boots. I'm making a business decision. Rourke barked out a laugh. What business? Exactly. Discount travel blogging. Celine giggled, high and thin. Boots. Camille ignored them both completely. Her thumb moved across the phone screen, scrolling past names that belonged to senators, studio executives, 3 separate Fortune 100 CEOs, until she found the one she wanted. Boots, Marcus Whitfield. Chief Operating Officer, Meridian Sky Holdings. He picked up on the first ring. Camille? You're supposed to be off-grid until Thursday. Boots. Everything all right? Change of plans, she said, calm as still water. I'm at Sterling Point in Scottsdale. I need 3 things immediately. Boots. Grady's smirk began, very slowly, to falter. The name Meridian Sky rang some distant, unpleasant bell in the back of his mind, the way a word you can't quite place lodges itself and refuses to leave. Boots. First, Camille continued, eyes locked directly on Grady. Issue a full operational stand-down for every Sterling Point aircraft in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, effective this minute. Boots. Marcus's voice sharpened instantly. Camille, that's not a delay, that's a full grounding. That's 7 figures in the first 6 hours alone. Boots. What's happened? Is this a safety issue? You could call it that, Camille said, eyes still on Grady. A catastrophic failure in the human systems at one of our flagship terminals. Boots. Priya looked like she might genuinely faint. Rourke and Celine had both stopped laughing, replaced by a confused, uneasy silence that spread through the lounge like cold water finding the low points in a floor. Boots. Other passengers were sitting up straight now, phones lowered, all pretense of minding their own business abandoned. Second, Camille said, there is a station manager standing in front of me named Grady Voss. Boots. When the calls start coming in, and they will, within minutes, patch every single one of them directly to my line. Boots. Grady felt the blood leave his face in a slow physical drain. And third, Camille finished, pull the full client file on a Rourke Delacroix. Boots. Booked on 642. Full travel history. Spend. Everything. I want it on my screen in 5 minutes. She turned to look directly at Rourke for the first time since he'd approached her. Really look at him, the way you look at a specimen under glass. Boots. I'm curious what the data says about our most important client. She hung up. The lounge held its breath. Then chaos arrived, all at once, the way it always does. Not gradually, but as a wall. Boots. Grady's earpiece began blinking so fast it looked like it was having a seizure. His personal phone buzzed against his hip, then buzzed again, then simply didn't stop. Boots. Priya's tablet flooded with red-flagged alerts, each one pinging louder than the last. Outside on the tarmac, the unmistakable whine of a jet engine spinning down cut through the glass. Boots. What did you do? Grady's voice cracked on the last word. You can't just cancel flights, Rourke said, though his certainty had visibly drained out of him, replaced by the first flicker of real fear Camille had seen on his face all day. Boots. This is insane. This is a stunt. Camille slipped her phone back into her tote, unhurried, and looked at the 3 of them. Rourke, Celine, Grady, not with anger, but with something colder and more final. The particular pity you feel watching someone finish, destroying themselves in real time. Boots. I can, she said simply, and I have. She walked to the coffee station, poured herself a fresh cup, unbothered, and returned to her chair. Boots. She picked her paperback back up as though nothing at all had happened. Grady's phone rang, high and frantic. He fumbled it to his ear. Boots. Hello. What do you mean grounded, all of them? By whose authority? He listened, his eyes widened. Boots. His gaze crawled slowly, and against his will, back toward the woman in the gray hoodie, calmly sipping her coffee. Boots. Whose authority, he repeated into the phone, voice shrinking with every word. He listened again, then, barely audible, the Ashworth call sign. Boots. He didn't know the phrase, but whoever was on the other end of that line clearly did, because Grady's face turned the color of the marble floor beneath him. Boots. He lowered the phone slowly. He looked at Camille, really looked, for the first time all afternoon, and something in his brain finally connected the impossible speed of the shutdown, the instant obedience over the phone, the phrase that had just made a national airline operations director go silent with fear. Boots. His voice trembled. You're Dr. Ashworth. You're Camille Ashworth. The name dropped into that silent lounge like a boulder into still water. Boots. The man with the Wall Street Journal actually stood up. The woman in scrubs gasped audibly. Everyone in that room, it turned out, knew that name. From Forbes covers, from aviation trade journals, from a widely shared TED Talk about equity in luxury service industries. Boots. Meridian Sky Holdings was not just an airline. It was, in this particular corner of the private aviation world, close to a religion. Boots. And they had just spent 20 minutes trying to bully its founder out of her own seat. Grady stumbled forward, hands clasped in a posture of genuine, desperate begging. Boots. Dr. Ashworth. I had absolutely no idea. This was a complete misunderstanding, please. Camille raised one hand. Boots. He stopped instantly, mid-sentence, like a man hitting an invisible wall. It was not a misunderstanding, Mr. Voss. Her voice had gone flat and cold, devoid of any warmth at all. Boots. It was a choice. You and your staff decided my value based on my clothes. You decided his importance based on his volume. Boots. You chose to remove the person you assumed was weakest in this room. That is not a misunderstanding. That's a policy failure, a training failure, and a failure of basic decency, running all the way to the top of this terminal, which, as it happens, is exactly where I sit. Boots. Her phone chimed softly. She glanced down. Marcus has sent Mr. Delacroix's file. She looked directly at Rourke now, whose face had gone slick and gray. Boots. This is fascinating reading. In 3 years, you've flown Sterling Point exactly twice, both times on a corporate discount code from a company that terminated your consulting contract 14 months ago. Boots. Your total lifetime revenue to this airline is less than what it costs us to de-ice a single wing in a light frost. Boots. She let that sit in the air for a beat, watching it land. The man you cut in line at security this morning, Mr. Boots. Delacroix, that's Harlan Vance. His firm owns the hangar leases at 3 of our largest hubs. The woman in scrubs behind you is Dr. Boots. Renata Ibarra on our medical advisory board for critical care transport. You are not a VIP, sir. You are barely a customer. Boots. Rourke opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Camille turned back to Grady. The grounding was not punishment, Mr. Voss. It was surgery. Boots. If this is the standard of judgment operating at my flagship terminal, I have to assume the rot runs deeper than one afternoon. Boots. We will audit every protocol at this location. Every employee will be retrained or removed. We are rebuilding this culture from the studs. One built on respect, not on flattering whoever shouts the loudest. Boots. 2 uniformed security officers stepped into the lounge at that moment, moving with quiet, unhurried purpose. They walked straight past Camille without a glance and stopped in front of Grady. Boots. Sir, the lead officer said, we need your terminal credentials. You've been terminated, effective immediately. Grady's mouth opened and closed twice with no sound coming out. Boots. He looked at Camille one last time, eyes pleading for a mercy she had no intention of extending. Then, slowly, he unclipped his ID badge and handed it over. Boots. The officers walked him out, his career in executive aviation ending not in a blaze of anger but in a slow, humiliating walk past every single person he had failed that day. Boots. Camille turned next to Priya, who was shaking, tears already gathering. Miss Kowalski. What you did came from a toxic culture that Mr. Boots. Voss built and rewarded. That's on him. But you also made a choice. You targeted the passenger you assumed was least likely to fight back. Boots. That is inexcusable, and it's on you too. You're on administrative leave, pending a full review. Use the time to think seriously about what service actually means. Boots. Priya nodded, unable to speak, and walked shakily toward the staff exit. Finally, Camille's gaze settled on Rourke and Celine, both of them frozen like animals caught in headlights they never saw coming. Boots. As for you, Mr. Delacroix. Her voice had gone to ice. Your flight is cancelled, obviously. Every booking privilege you have with Sterling Point and every subsidiary of Meridian Sky Holdings is permanently revoked, effective this second. Boots. You can't do that, Celine shrieked, her composure finally cracking wide open. We have to be in Aspen. Rourke knows people. Boots. The gala will proceed just fine without either of you, Camille said, with something close to genuine indifference. And the people, Mr. Boots. Delacroix will very shortly know him as the man who single-handedly grounded an entire regional fleet because he couldn't tolerate waiting his turn like everyone else in this room. Boots. I imagine that'll make for excellent conversation at the next fundraiser he's not invited to. She stood, gathered her tote and her paperback, and turned toward the tarmac exit. Boots. A junior flight coordinator jogged up, out of breath. Dr. Ashworth, your aircraft is being prepped. Ready in 15 minutes. Boots. Your bags are already aboard. Thank you, Camille said and started walking. Behind her, Rourke made one last desperate lunge. Boots. Wait, please, this'll ruin me. That deal was everything I had left. Camille stopped at the doorway. She did not turn around. Boots. Your ruin is a consequence of your own character, Mr. Delacroix, she said without a trace of heat in her voice. Boots. You built your whole life on a foundation of noise. You shouldn't be surprised when a little bit of truth is enough to knock it flat. Boots. And then she was gone, leaving behind a lounge full of shattered plans, a ruined career, and the particular silence that settles after something has finally been set right. Boots. The moment the terminal door closed behind Camille, the room seemed to exhale, and then almost immediately it inhaled again with fury, all of it aimed at one man. Boots. Harlan Vance, the real estate developer with 3 hangar leases, walked slowly over to where Rourke stood, still stunned, one hand braced against a marble pillar, as though the floor had tilted beneath him. Boots. Mr. Delacroix. Harlan's voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. Your little tantrum just cost me a 9-month-in-the-making meeting in Aspen. Boots. My firm, the one that leases hangar space to this airline, the airline you just insulted its owner in front of, is going to be having a very uncomfortable call with Meridian Sky tomorrow morning. Boots. And I intend to make absolutely certain that everyone in my circle, and in that Aspen circle you're so desperate to belong to, hears exactly what kind of man you are. Boots. Dr. Renata Ibarra approached next, her voice tight and controlled in the way of someone holding back something much larger. Boots. I was flying to Aspen to consult on a 6 a.m. pediatric cardiac surgery tomorrow. A child's surgical team is now scrambling because you couldn't handle being treated like an ordinary person for 10 minutes. Boots. I will get there by helicopter if I have to. But understand something, medicine is a small world, mister. Boots. Delacroix. Word travels. Celine and Rourke stood surrounded now, not by security, but by the quiet, cold fury of genuinely powerful people whose evenings they had just detonated. Boots. There was nowhere in that lounge to hide, and the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. For Grady Voss, being walked out by security was only the opening act of his professional collapse. Boots. Private aviation is a small, gossiping industry, built entirely on reputation, and by the time Grady's Uber pulled away from Sterling Point, the story of the terminal he'd grounded was already moving through group chats and back channels faster than any press release could have managed. Boots. 2 headhunters who had tentative offers out to him rescinded them before he'd even made it home. Within 11 days, his name had become industry shorthand for exactly the kind of manager nobody wanted to hire. Boots. Within 4 months, he was managing the overnight shift at an airport parking garage in Mesa, watching private jets take off from a chain-link fence a quarter-mile from where his career used to be. Boots. Priya's story went differently. During her leave, she did exactly what Camille had told her to do. She sat with it. Boots. She read back through her own decision, hour by hour, and was horrified by how quickly she had folded under pressure, how automatically she had reached for the passenger who looked least likely to make trouble. Boots. She wrote a long, unflinching letter of resignation that didn't ask for anything, just laid out what she'd done and why it was wrong. Boots. When it crossed Camille's desk weeks later, Camille read it twice and quietly instructed HR to confirm to any future employer that Priya had left in good standing and shown real accountability. Boots. It wouldn't restart her aviation career. She didn't want that anymore, but it gave her a clean page to write something else on. Boots. Rourke Delacroix's collapse took longer, and it was worse, because he never once stopped explaining why none of it was his fault. Boots. The Aspen deal died within 48 hours. Boots. When his investors heard his excuse for missing the closing dinner, I was kicked off a flight by the woman who turns out to own the entire airline, and then she grounded the whole fleet because of me. It sounded less like bad luck, and more like the unraveling of a man they'd already quietly suspected was over-leveraged. Boots. They pulled out that same week. A financial journalist who happened to be in that lounge that afternoon, the man with the Wall Street Journal, as it turned out, got curious and started digging. Boots. What she found was a mountain of personal debt, 3 failed ventures, and a social media presence built almost entirely on rented cars and borrowed rooms. Boots. The resulting piece, titled "The Man Who Grounded a Fleet for Nothing," was picked up by 2 regional business outlets and went modestly, brutally viral in exactly the circles Rourke had spent years trying to impress. Boots. His credit lines closed, his partners stopped returning calls. Celine left within the month, taping a note to the kitchen counter that read, "I can't be associated with this kind of failure," and was seen 3 weeks later on the arm of a hedge fund analyst with considerably better credit. Boots. Rourke moved back into his mother's guest room in Chandler that autumn. He still, to anyone who would listen, called it a temporary strategic pause. Boots. He never once, in any conversation anyone reported back to Camille, said the words "I was wrong." The final blow came 7 months later, and it arrived so quietly that Rourke didn't even see it coming until it had already landed. Boots. A logistics contractor that Meridian Sky used for aircraft parts distribution was closing out final background checks on a promising candidate for a warehouse coordinator position at their Phoenix facility. Boots. The name flagged instantly in the shared vendor system. Delacroix, Rourke A. Permanent facility ban. Meridian Sky Holdings. Cause code. Conduct violation. Boots. The contractor rescinded the offer within the hour, apologetic but unwilling to risk their largest client relationship over one hire. Boots. Rourke never learned exactly why the offer disappeared. He assumed, as he assumed most things, that it was bad luck. Boots. It wasn't luck. It was a line of code sitting quietly in a database, indifferent and permanent, closing doors he didn't even know he was walking toward. Boots. That refusal to ever say the words "I was wrong." More than the lost deal, more than the empty condo, more than Celine's note on the counter, more than the warehouse job he never even knew he'd lost, was the thing that finally finished him. Boots. He had spent his whole life believing loudness was the same thing as power. When the noise stopped working, and the doors kept closing anyway, he discovered he had built absolutely nothing underneath it. Boots. Just noise, and now, finally, silence where the noise used to be. For Camille, the incident at Sterling Point wasn't a victory to savor. Boots. It was a diagnosis, proof that something had been quietly rotting inside her own company, and that she had built enough anonymity into her life to nearly miss it entirely. Boots. The next morning, instead of resuming her vacation, she sat in a glass-walled conference room at Meridian Sky's Tempe headquarters, leading a crisis meeting with her senior team. Boots. Marcus Whitfield had the numbers ready. The grounding cost us $4.1 million in lost revenue and rebooking compensation, he said. Boots. Reputational exposure is harder to price, but it's real. It's the correct expense, Camille said, unshaken. The cost of ignoring rot is always higher than the cost of cutting it out. Boots. What happened yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a culture that started rewarding the appearance of wealth over the substance of character. Boots. That ends now. Over the following weeks, she personally rewrote the company's service protocol from the ground up. Boots. It became known internally as the Ashworth Standard. Every passenger, regardless of attire, volume, or perceived status, was to be treated with identical baseline respect, and under no circumstance was a confirmed, checked-in passenger to be involuntarily removed to accommodate another traveler. Boots. She brought in an outside firm to overhaul hiring and training from the first interview onward, with mandatory scenario testing on bias and de-escalation for every employee, from baggage handlers to senior vice presidents. Boots. She also killed the old informal VIP system that had let a loud voice and an expensive watch pass for importance. Boots. In its place, a new client office tracked actual metrics, flight history, conduct, revenue, tenure, so that the quiet, loyal passengers like Harlan Vance and Dr. Boots. Ibarra would always be recognized for what they'd actually earned, not what they demanded. The audit that followed turned up something Camille hadn't expected, and it was worse than one bad afternoon at one terminal. Boots. Buried in 18 months of internal complaint logs, mostly closed out with a generic apology voucher and never escalated, were 11 separate incidents at 4 different hubs where a passenger had been involuntarily bumped or downgraded under circumstances eerily similar to what had happened to her. Quiet passengers, unremarkable clothing, no entourage, always making way for someone louder. Boots. 2 of the 11 had been employees who'd complained internally and been quietly reassigned instead of heard. Grady Voss, it turned out, was not an aberration. Boots. He was simply the version of the problem that had finally happened to the one passenger with the power to stop it. Boots. Camille sat with that list for a long time before she brought it to her board, because it confirmed the thing she'd feared most since founding the company. That good intentions at the top mean nothing if nobody is checking what happens in the room where the actual decisions get made. Boots. She called every single passenger inconvenienced by the grounding personally, including Harlan and Renata, and didn't make excuses. She explained exactly what had happened and exactly what she was doing to make sure it never happened again. Boots. Most of them, impressed by the directness, became more loyal to Meridian Sky than before, not less. 1 month later, Camille sat on the cedar deck of a small mountain lodge outside Flagstaff, a blanket over her knees and a mug of tea warming her hands, the San Francisco peaks catching the last orange light of the day. Boots. She had allowed herself 3 full days without a phone. This was the vacation she had actually been trying to take the whole time. Boots. Her tablet chimed once with a message she'd let through. It was from Dr. Renata Ibarra. Dr. Ashworth, I wanted you to know the surgery went perfectly. Boots. The little boy is recovering well. I also flew Sterling Point again last week. Different airline entirely. Calm, attentive, genuinely present staff. The kind of service that isn't trained, it's built. Boots. Thank you for what you did that day. You didn't just fix a mistake. You changed a culture. That's rare, and it matters more than you probably realize. Boots. Camille read it twice, something warm moving through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. Her tablet buzzed again. A video call from Marcus. Boots. She answered, propping the screen against her knee. You actually made it to a mountain this time, he said, grinning. Boots. I'll keep this under 10 minutes. It's fine, Marcus. What's the latest? Q3 numbers are in from Sterling Point, specifically. Boots. After the initial 2-day dip, we're up 18% in bookings from our top 2 client tiers. Retention sitting at 98%. Boots. He paused, and there's a footnote you'll like. Last week at our Teterboro hub, a new client, some tech founder notoriously difficult, blew up because his preferred catering wasn't available. Boots. Instead of caving or escalating, the junior agent calmly validated his frustration, explained the supply issue clearly, and had 3 comparable options sourced within 10 minutes. Boots. Guy sent a written commendation. 2 years ago, that agent would have handed him a voucher and hidden in the break room. Boots. Camille nodded, and the satisfaction she felt had nothing to do with the 18%. It was the 10 minutes. Boots. It was a 23-year-old employee choosing dignity over fear, because the system around her had finally made that the easier choice. Boots. One more thing, Marcus said, a small grin forming. Final echo of the Delacroix situation. We got a background check inquiry from a logistics firm we contract with for parts shipping. Boots. They were vetting a candidate for a warehouse coordinator role. Let me guess, Camille said. Rourke Delacroix. Flagged instantly. Our contract gives us the right to bar any contractor's staff from our facilities, and his name came back red. Boots. They pulled the offer same day. Hard to hire a warehouse coordinator who's permanently banned from your biggest client's property. Boots. Camille was quiet a moment, picturing it, not with triumph, but with the flat, clean recognition of a system finally working exactly as designed. Boots. There was no joy in it, there didn't need to be. The system did what it was built to do, she said. Boots. Thanks, Marcus. Enjoy your weekend. She ended the call and looked back out at the mountains, thinking about the woman she'd been in that lounge. See. Boots. Reyes, unremarkable, invisible, a deliberate experiment in seeing her own company the way a stranger would. The results had been worse than she'd feared. Boots. They hadn't seen a customer. They hadn't seen a person at all. They'd seen an obstacle to be cleared for someone louder. Boots. The grounding hadn't been revenge. Revenge is personal and hot, and it burns out fast. What she'd done was cooler than that, and it would last longer. She had simply held up a mirror and let 2 people watch their own reflections shatter under the weight of what they actually were. Boots. She hadn't been their punishment. She'd been the consequence. A breeze moved through the pines below the deck, and somewhere down the slope, a hawk called once and went quiet. Boots. Camille closed her eyes, breathed in the thin mountain air, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, felt something close to peace. Not because everything had been fixed, but because, for once, the people who deserved to be seen finally had been, and the people who deserved to answer for what they'd done finally had.